Welcome to Because the Beatles, the podcast about the Beatles, everything about the Beatles 24/8. I'm Erica.
And I'm Allison. And before we start, please be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, or stream us on Spotify. And if you're enjoying BC the Beatles, feel free to leave us a preferably 5-star review so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
And don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, and TikTok. We'll be posting videos, photos, and more from this episode and beyond. And you can also email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. Our guest today is another incredible woman in the Beatles universe, Laurie Kaye. As a young rock journalist, Laurie got the opportunity of a lifetime to spend the day with John and Yoko at their home in New York City. She and her team spent hours with the couple, and the resulting interview was one of the most candid John had ever given. It touched on a wide range of topics, including their latest album release, John's lost weekend, and his thoughts on the Beatles. It ended on an optimistic note, with John having high hopes for the future. But that day was December 8th, 1980, and that interview was the last one that John ever gave. A few short hours later, John was tragically murdered.
And Laurie tells this story and so many more in her new book, Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper: My Life Leading Up to John Lennon's Last Interview. In this memoir, Laurie details her life up to that fateful day in 1980, a day she called both the best and worst day of my life.
A little bit about Laurie. She began her career at San Francisco's top 40 radio station, KFRC-AM, where she was both an on-air reporter and writer. She later moved to RKO Radio, where she co-produced many rock specials, including RKO Presents the Beatles, which was later expanded and renamed The Beatles from Liverpool to Legend. Other notable projects include writing Dick Clark's weekly radio countdown show and leading the location production of The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King special extended DVD edition. Laurie now works in the film and TV industry, handling creative content and line producing for network docuseries. Welcome to BC the Beatles, Laurie. It's so good to have you.
Thank you. So good to be here.
We've both read your book. We loved your book. And your book is not just about the Beatles, not just about your career, but it's a memoir of your life and how you came to where you ended up in 1980. So let's start at the beginning. What attracted you to rock music and to a career in music journalism?
Well, basically, it was my dysfunctional family upbringing, which led me to listen to top 40 radio in Los Angeles starting out as a toddler, especially once I got my own transistor radio with earplugs that I wore and listened to every night, all through the night in bed, and kept with me all day, too. And rock radio music continued to play a major part of my life throughout my school years. And when I won tickets from KMET-FM to see the Rolling Stones Nicaragua benefit concert at the Forum as a high school senior, the disc jockey who gave them to me, B. Mitchell Reed, also known as the Beamer, totally complimented me and excited me when he began asking me questions and saying that with a voice like mine, I belonged on the air. So my career should definitely be in radio. And then when I was a journalism school student at UC Berkeley, one of my professors there told me that since I already obviously knew how to write, instead of staying in college, I should just get an internship and turn it into a journalism job right away, which I was able to do at KFRC in San Francisco. I started out there as their very first newsroom intern and then became the news editor. And because the station's executives were super impressed with my abilities, I quickly began writing scripts, interviewing artists, and co-producing rock radio specials in addition to my news department gig, which eventually became the on-air news anchor job I loved.
That is so cool. It's so colorful, and you've done so much in music. And I love that it just sort of came up organically, because obviously listening to your voice now, you definitely were made for some sort of radio job.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we were just chatting a little bit, and we're both in LA. And so I love the history of the LA music scene. I think it's just so storied, so legendary. And you discuss in your book a ton of memories of the music scene in the 70s, which is epic. And of course, first as a fan and later as a reporter and a writer. Can you talk a little bit? I mean, I'm sure there are so many, But what were the most impactful moments that you experienced during that time?
Wow, so many cool concerts as a high school student. Everyone from Neil Young to James Taylor to Elton John, and especially seeing David Bowie's show at the tail end of his Ziggy Stardust tour at the Long Beach Arena. And not only was Bowie amazingly awesome to watch perform and change his super specially designed costumes so many times, but he played songs from his next album, Aladdin Sane, which he just recorded. And immediately, the Genie became my absolute favorite song of his for the rest of his entire career. Of course, seeing the Rolling Stones Nicaragua benefit, those tickets I won and got to sit in the front row, literally feet away from Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. And the band was just incredible. It was one of the best shows also that I've ever seen.
That's amazing.
There's nothing more fun than winning something on the radio. Like when I was 12, I won tickets to Beatlemania on the radio, and it's still like one of the high points that I called in and I won and I got in the radio. It's that feeling of excitement.
Yeah.
You talk about these amazing concerts, and I can't imagine the David Bowie show. And I gotta agree, Genie is a great song. But what were some of your favorite clubs that you went to? Because again, so many epic, the Whiskey, you've got the Rainbow down the street, the Roxy, what were some of your haunts?
When I was in school, I went to the Troubadour.
Yeah.
I saw the very first Loggins and Messina show there, which was really cool. But I honestly didn't go to the Whiskey until afterwards when I was coming back to visit LA again from college. The Roxy didn't open until I was leaving for college. The day, literally, that I was about to leave for college, Neil Young was going to do the very first Roxy show. And a friend of mine was going to go and could get tickets. But unfortunately, I couldn't because I needed to go check into to school where I was about to start at Santa Cruz. One of my favorite venues was also the Santa Monica Civic. I saw Paul Simon's
Yeah.
first solo tour there. That was really great. I had a very cool time, and tickets back then weren't expensive. So it was wonderful.
Yeah. The good old days for real. So moving more into your journalism career, your writing career, you were a young woman coming up through the 70s and 80s. And obviously, journalism was, and still is a male dominated field. And especially, I guess, at that time. So, did you encounter much gender based bias?
Well, it was definitely a male dominated time, but lucky for me, as an intern, I became immediately really close to KFRC's only female newscaster, the super talented Joe Interrante, who happened to be hired there not long before and was brought out from Texas to be the station's news director. So she was very open to encouraging me and making sure I became equal along with her to all the men in the department when it came to news writing, interviewing, and making major lasting impressions. So I really owe so much to her.
Well, it's amazing that you found a woman to mentor you in such a fantastic way. I mean, that's a gift anywhere, but especially in such a male-dominated field. Let's turn our attention to the subject of our podcast. How did your career first intersect with the Beatles?
Well, thanks to wonderful news director Joe Interrante, who KFRC music director Dave Sholin asked to write the Beatles special for RKO Radio. She recommended me instead because she was too busy raising children and running the newsroom. And I immediately began to do an incredible amount of Beatles research and writing for what turned out to be the longest Beatles radio show ever created in our country. And I also ended up co producing the show, which was called RKO Presents the Beatles, which started out as a 14-hour special. And then we were able to expand it to 17 hours and rename it using the original title that I first came up with, The Beatles from Liverpool to Legend.
It's a great title.
I'd listen to anything that was 17 hours long about the Beatles. Peter
Yeah.
Jackson has nothing on you.
So good.
Before you worked on the project, were you a Beatles fan?
I'd been a Beatles fan ever since I first started hearing their music as a little kid on the radio in LA on top 40 stations, KRLA, and my favorite, KHJ, which I didn't know at the time was the RKO sister station of KFRC in San Francisco, where I'd end up starting my career. I then got to see the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was so exciting back in 1964. And a couple years later, in August 66, thanks to a friend's super special, unexpected birthday party, I got to see their live show at Dodger Stadium. It was mostly full of screaming female teens jumping up and down, but still super exciting and turned out to be the Beatles' second to last live tour show ever.
Can't imagine going to that Dodgers Stadium show. That must have been incredible.
Super exciting, yes.
As you progressed in your career, you had so many incredible interviews, and they're detailed in your book. Talking Heads, the Ramones, and John Lennon was not the first of Beatles related interviews that you did. Can you talk first, before we get into John, about some of the other interviews that you had with people in the Beatles universe?
First up was my solo interview with George Harrison just after he'd become a father to Danny in 1978 and gotten married to Olivia, who he'd met when she worked at the record company. And he was just about to release his self-titled album. And it was really exciting because I got to ask him all kinds of questions about what gave him the most satisfaction, his years with the Beatles or his solo years. And he jokingly responded, I think gardening, because he was really into staying home and raising his son and being with his wife at the time. And that was a wonderful interview and just one of my very favorites. And I was so very sad when he died eventually.
And then after that, you went with your team to England, right? For the first time?
Yes, as I call the chapter about it in my book, London Calling, which is one of my favorite Clash songs.
Very appropriate.
Every chapter in my book is named after a pop, rock, or musical song. And I got to go to London for my very first time with Dave Sholin and technical producer Ron Hummel to interview Paul and Linda McCartney and their latest lineup of Wings. That was on June 16th, 1979, right after the release of what turned out to be the last Wings album, Back to the Egg.
Oh, wow. Wow. So you had Danny Lane and Lawrence Juber, that great lineup, that last lineup of Wings. What was it like to hang out with Paul and Linda?
Oh, it was amazing. And one of the first things I wanted to know was how Paul and Linda managed to keep up with their current musical career, yet still maintain such a close relationship with their family. And Paul, having such a great sense of humor, said, super glue. We all started laughing. And Linda chimed in, adding super glue and nice deodorant. It was an interview full of a sense of humor and consideration. Paul asked me if I'd seen Linda's first book, Linda's Pictures, and I said, no, I didn't have it. And he immediately got up and ran into the other room and brought out a brand new copy for me. And he and Linda autographed it. It was wonderful. And then he and Linda and Denny Lane all gave me a copy of a single of Silly Love Songs and autographed it for me. And of course, I still have that as well. They were just warm and wonderful. And at the end, when Paul gave me a hug and a big kiss, it was like, oh my God, I'm a little kid again, and I'm being kissed by Paul McCartney. I can't believe it. It was amazing.
I mean, my inner teenager is screaming when you tell the story.
Yeah.
I wasn't even there.
Yes. A lot of our listeners will be very jealous, Laurie.
Yeah.
I mean, we are. So
Definitely.
I get it.
So then came the interview with John and Yoko. How did your team at RKO land that interview?
Well, actually, I should tell you before that, early that year in January 1980, was my interview with their amazing producer, George Martin.
Oh, yes.
This one at my news studio at KFRC. It was a solo interview I did with him. It was amazing. And it was following the release of his bio, All You Need Is Ears, which was wonderful and very inspirational to me before I started writing my book. And he talked about happy and unhappy times working with the Beatles. And he was just wonderful. And he autographed his book lovingly to me. And that was terrific. And then, of course, the John and Yoko interview was nearly a year later in December.
Was that a reference from Paul McCartney?
Well, that was a rumor that I'd heard that John had asked Paul, we're only going to do one interview with the release of Double Fantasy on US radio. Do you have any recommendations? Because Paul did so many interviews, but I don't know if that's true. And what I really think happened is no doubt the interview came to us thanks to our creation of the much loved network special, RKO Presents the Beatles, as well as our previous RKO team interview with Paul and Linda and Wings, and of course my solo interviews with George Harrison and George Martin. Plus, music director Dave Sholin was super popular and very well respected, especially by Warner Brothers Geffen Records and their executive Bert Keane, who came to the Dakota in New York with Dave and me and Ron Hummel for what tragically turned out to be John Lennon's last interview.
That was a tragic and heartbreaking part of the story, and we will certainly get there. But first, I want to hear more about what was it like? You're getting this interview with John and Yoko. They do so few interviews. John was out of the spotlight for so many years before Double Fantasy. How do you prep for an interview like that?
Well, as I say in my book, the build-up to our John Lennon interview was somewhat mind-blowing. And at one point, while everything was still in the early planning stages, I got a call from someone asking the date, year, and time of my birth, because apparently Yoko was working with her personal astrologer, who was going to take all the information collected and then use it to put together an astrological chart that would then determine the best possible day for our Dakota meetup. And of course, the surprising thing is that even with all that intimate information, and despite the fact that John and Yoko had already planned to head to Hawaii and the West Coast during that same time period, somehow Monday, December 8th, 1980, a date that will live forever in freakish rock and roll infamy, was chosen. And it's what I'll always refer to, as you mentioned before, as the day the music died and the best and worst day of my life.
Wow. That is prophetic that her astrologer came up with that date. I wonder if it was more loaded, in the reading than just an interview. Maybe there was something, obviously, there was something unseen there as well.
It contributed to all the guilt I've felt ever since.
Oh my gosh, that's horrible. I'm so
Yeah,
sorry to hear that.
I can't feel
Um,
guilt about that.
yeah, there's only one person that needs to feel guilty about what happened.
Yeah, and that person is in prison.
Yes, hopefully for the rest of his life, if Yoko has anything to say about it. Yoko and I'm sure Sean. So take us back to that day. What did it feel like to walk into the Dakota, which, as we all know, is a huge, old, imposing building and so legendary in New York? What did it feel like to walk in there knowing that you were going to interview John and Yoko?
Well, I felt like I was floating along the sidewalk as we walked from where our limo dropped us off. It was just so amazing. I couldn't help but feeling I must be dreaming. This isn't really happening. And then, especially when we walked from the public office, left their assistants, and I first saw the interior of their private office where we were about to set up and get ready for the interview. Everything there was so great to check out, from the fuzzy white shag carpet to the cool furniture there, which included a super long glass top coffee table that I still remember like it's in my own house. It had metal snakes sliding up its legs, and the love seat alongside that table was super comfortable for me to sit on. So when John joined us and sat right next to me on it, I felt like I was having the best dream of my entire life.
I can't even imagine. I think I would have been out of my mind.
I had been concerned when I was coming up with questions because we'd been told you cannot bring up the Beatles. You cannot bring up the past. You can only talk about double fantasy and what's going on currently. So I was very careful to do that in the questions that I came up with for me and Dave. The cool thing was, John was the one who brought up the Beatles, and John was the one who brought up the past. Everything from first meeting up with Paul McCartney to first meeting up with Yoko and telling us the stories. It was great.
That interview is known for being so wide-ranging, and he was so open, and he was so I don't know, he was free with his thoughts, he was expansive, it's an incredible piece, and it's just amazing the way it happened on that particular day. It wasn't just John that was there either, Yoko was there as well. We're huge Yoko fans over here, so what was it like to meet her?
Oh, well, Yoko was super friendly and sweet and informative. And not just because we were the only females in the group, but also because she was so pleased to see that I brought my personal copy of her terrific book, Grapefruit, with me, which she
Oh,
told
nice.
me and John hadn't seen in years. And
Oh.
I had bought it several years before when I was a student in Berkeley and stopped at the big bookstore there, and there was a discount table, and Grapefruit was on it. And I thought, oh my God, I can finally afford it. So I bought it. But who would have ever thought that within 5 years, I would not only be interviewing the author, but her amazing husband, John Lennon. It was something I never, ever would have imagined. And like I said, both John and Yoko were totally thrilled and super eager to autograph it for me because I brought it. And even John, who bragged about having written the introduction to the book. And it was just amazing. And I still have the copy of my book, and it's one of my most prized possessions.
That must have been so delightful for both of them because you brought something that was Yoko's, that John was proud of, and you were genuinely interested in both of them. And it must have opened up so many doors as far as, establishing a level of comfort and ease when you got down to the interviewing.
Absolutely. And not only that, but they were both thrilled because I brought a gift for Sean too.
Oh,
And even though he wasn't there that day, he was out with his nanny away from the Dakota all day. I brought him a wind up, spark breathing dragon toy that I bought in Chinatown in San Francisco for Sean, thinking, oh, a little kid's going to love this. And not only did Yoko say it was cool, but when John saw it, his attitude was, oh my God, I don't know that I'm going to give this to Sean. I may want to keep this for myself.
Oh,
And he let it go up and down that super long glass coffee table and was just so excited about it. It was thrilling. And of course, for the next 44, almost 44 years, I've been wondering, did Yoko ever give it to Sean after John was killed? Or did she throw it away because it gave her bad memories? And I never met Sean, so I could never ask him. And believe it or not, last month I finally did meet Sean Lennon at a screening of his short animated film War is Over, which just won an Academy Award. And he was there at the screening, which was at a museum in Beverly Hills. And I went up and introduced myself and told him that I had done his father's very last interview, which he was amazed about. And I gave him a copy of my book that I had with me and signed it for him. And I said, and Sean, I've been wanting to ask you for nearly 44 years, did you ever get the toy that I brought for you? And I described it, and he said, oh my God, yes, I remember it. I can't believe how much I loved
oh,
it. And
oh,
just hearing that from him made me feel so incredible. And he said that he was really eager to read my book and share it with his mother, Yoko. So,
oh, that's so great.
what a wonderful full circle moment you had there. Wow.
absolutely.
Oh, and I know you were with your team was with John and Yoko for about 4 hours, and then of course you left, and then just a few short hours later, tragedy happened and John was murdered. How did you hear about it, and what did you do in the immediate aftermath?
Well, I should explain what happened, and that is the reason that the interview wound up when it did, and we didn't spend more time just hanging out together and taking pictures and getting autographs and everything and just yakking because I felt like I'd made lifetime friends with John and Yoko. I couldn't help but hear that the phone was ringing a lot, and Yoko was getting calls from her assistant saying that their recording studio session was coming up. But unfortunately, their driver wasn't going to be able to take them. So Yoko asked if we could give them a ride in our limo to the recording studio. And the guys were all going back to the West Coast that night. I was the only one staying in New York. Their plane was about to leave, I think around 5:30 or 6 or something. And they said, yes, sure, but then we'll have to go soon because we need to catch our flight. And so we all ended up leaving the Dakota and walking out. John and Yoko came after us. Before they did, there was this really creepy guy standing outside and saying to me, did you talk to him? Did you get his autograph? What did he say? What did he say? What were you talking about? And it was just creepy. But our record executive, Bert Keane, gave him an album and said, oh, well, when John comes out, he'll autograph it for you. And it was a copy of Double Fantasy. So then John and Yoko walked out and John autographed it for him, which creeped me out. And then they all got in the limo and I hugged John and Yoko and said goodbye. And we had made plans to get together in a couple weeks to have dinner in San Francisco because John and Yoko were going to be there. And we were going to eat at Yoko's favorite Japanese restaurant, which I was really excited about. So I said goodbye and they drove off. And then I started walking off to my friend's office that I was going to be having dinner with, which was the reason that I was staying in New York. And this guy, this creepy guy, started following me down the sidewalk and asking me the same questions. Did you talk to him? Did you get his autograph? What did he say? What happened? And I really just wanted to smack him or run away and get rid of him. But finally, I just turned around and gave him a dirty look and said, go away. And he finally stopped following me. And I continued on to my friend's office and told him about the wonderful interview and how great it was. And he was so excited. My friend, also named Dave. And we went to dinner. And then after dinner, we went to the apartment in New York that he had just moved into. And as he was opening the door, he said, oh, you're going to hear the radio because I leave it on so people will think if they try and break in that I'm home and go away and break in somewhere else. And so he opened the door, the radio was on, and all of a sudden a reporter came on and said, John Lennon has been shot and he's at the Roosevelt Hospital. And I went, oh my God. And I ran out to the middle of the street, jumped in a taxi cab and went to the hospital and got out. And through the big glass door of the hospital, I saw Yoko Ono right in the lobby. And she was holding on to somebody I didn't recognize at first, but she was crying hysterically. And the more that I looked at her, as much as I wanted to go in and comfort her and say everything was going to be okay, I just knew in the back of my mind, no, John hadn't just been shot. He'd been shot and killed. And so I was afraid to go in because I didn't want to upset her because I was afraid she would also blame me for being the one who was the reason that they were there that day and that John got shot. So instead, I went over to the side of the hospital and called the RKO network, which was now in New York. And the big executive there was my former news director, Joe Interrante. And she said, when I told her what was going on, she said, oh my God, come immediately to our network office. And I did. And I worked all night doing interviews and writing up things for newspapers and all that sort of thing. And then finally, a newscast came on that admitted that John hadn't just been shot, he'd been killed. And it showed the guy who'd confessed. And sure enough, it was that creepy guy who had followed me and bugged me earlier. So, of course, immediately I felt even more guilty. And I have ever since.
Oh, that's awful.
Mm. That's so intense. I mean, you were there to witness that whole day practically. And being there at the Roosevelt must have been just stunning. You described seeing Yoko. I can't imagine what that must have been like in real time.
It was tragic.
Yes. And of course, you talk about the moment where John's murderer has him sign his copy of Double Fantasy, and that, of course, is commemorated in a photograph, which is absolutely chilling. We've only heard stories about how creepy he was outside of the Dakota that day, but as you describe it, it just gives me chills.
Thank you. And I also want to thank you for not mentioning his name because I don't mention it or print it, and I haven't in years because I don't want to give him the publicity that he was looking for and never will.
Yes.
No, we don't. We don't say it either.
Yeah.
My God. How did that day change you and change your career and just change the direction of your life?
Well, it made me feel so tragic and guilty that I wasn't sure that I ever wanted to work on rock music specials or do interviews ever again. Although I did end up because I had quite a few already scheduled with RKO following my trip to New York. Everyone from interviewing Neil Diamond right afterwards to Barry Manilow to so many more. Plus, I went to work at other companies doing everything from writing and voicing a weekly syndicated music magazine rock column for a company called The Creative Factor, to joining Dick Clark Productions to write his weekly countdown show and ghostwriting his syndicated newspaper column. And then by the mid 80s, I decided it was time to start out in TV production. So I moved to New York to write a weekly USA Network music video countdown show called TV 2000, which led to my career for years in TV, video, and film work.
That's a total change. So, what motivated you to write this book now, 40 plus years after the event happened?
Well, when COVID hit and TV production came to an almost instant close, I suddenly had time to consider whether or not I really wanted to write my memoir, which I ended up doing despite all the guilt. And I was able to get a literary agent and start writing it right away. But so many others did also at the same time that I was told by my agent that no major book publishers would be interested in non celebrity memoirs. So I had to end up finding my own traditional independent publisher, which turned out to be Fayetteville Mafia Press, which worked out really well and much better than self publishing would have for me, because that was something I definitely had no desire to do. And I'd already put off writing my book for over 4 decades, thanks not only to my super busy career, but also because I didn't want to embarrass my mother by talking about my dysfunctional family upbringing and her part in it. And plus, with John Lennon gone, I felt terrible because that was the main reason I originally decided to write my book in the first place all those years ago. When he told me how excited he was to have his friends sign their books for him, and when I told him, oh, well, when I write my book, I definitely will, he said, great, which made me feel great. And in my mind, thinking, oh, I'm going to write my book and send it to John as soon as possible. But of course, he got killed. So thanks to guilt and feeling just so tragic, I never did.
Wow.
Well, I'm glad you got the chance to do it. And I think that this is an interview that people have heard for decades now. I mean, it revealed so much about John and his mindset and his hopes for the future. And to have somebody, a firsthand account, not even an observer, but a participant in so many of the things that day, it's a story that needed to be told. And I'm so glad it was told. And I'm so glad that you were able to join us today to
Yeah.
share your story with us.
Thank you. Me too. It's been great speaking with you both.
So, where can people find you and follow your work?
Well, they can go everywhere from my book's website, which is confessions of a rock and roll name dropper.com, to my social media pages, including Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, X, formerly Twitter. You name it, I'm there.
Yeah, we will tag your website in our show notes so that people can find you and your book easily. And as Laurie says, definitely check her out on social media as well.
Again, the book is called Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper: My Life Leading Up to John Lennon's Last Interview, available in print, ebook, and audiobook. And special shout out to the audiobook edition, because not only does Laurie read it, but when there's transcripts of somebody like John or George, it's not just a reading of it, the actual clip of the interview is in there. So it gives a totally different depth to the experience, I think, of hearing the story. And it's not just the Beatles, it's the Ramones, members of the Talking Heads. Even Arnold Schwarzenegger makes an appearance in the book. So very fun. And, of course, much more poignant too when you hear John's actual words on that day alongside Laurie's recollections.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun to record and self-voice and put together along with the producer. So yes, I'm really happy with that also.
Oh, that's so great. Well, Laurie, we thank you again so much for not only your book, but also, of course, being here with us today. And thank you to our listeners for listening to BC the Beatles. And as always, subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you're listening right now. And please give us a 5-star review or a rating, a review, so other Beatlemaniacs can find us.
Yes, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, and TikTok. We'll be posting photos, videos, and more from this episode and beyond. And remember, you can always email us at bcthebeatles@gmail.com. See you next time. Bye.
Bye.